Hello, good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on when you are joining us today. We welcome everyone and thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Wellbeing and Mindfulness. My name is Elizabeth White, and I'm the team lead of Learning and Development at the Work Wellness Institute, and I will be here to help host and moderate today's webinar and discussion. I would like to start by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We would like to take a brief moment to thank our academic team and 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent Project. Harnessing Talent Alliance for Recruiting and Retaining Canadians with Disabilities and Mental Health Challenges is a multi-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC as well as memberships to WWI. And of course, we'd also like to thank our advisory committee and our speakers who contribute to this webinar series. Just a couple of quick housekeeping points before we get started today. Hopefully at this point you've been able to hear me and are able to see our presentation title slide on your screen and through your computer speakers or through the conference line if you chose to dial in. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please look to the GoToWebinar panel that should be on your screen. If you go to that questions box, that is your direct communication portal with us today. So any technical issues, feel free to send it through there, as well as if there's questions, thoughts, anything that comes up throughout the conversation today, please feel free to use that as your communication portal with us. And just a note that we will be having a question and answer period section at the end of this presentation. So again, that is where you can submit your questions. If any thoughts are coming up of what happens after today's webinar, we will be ensuring that there's a post communication to all attendees today that includes any presentation materials, any questions that we might not have gotten time to today if we run out of time, as well as the recording link as well. And a final note to our members, just a reminder that your free certificate of attendance will automatically be sent to you as long as you've done the appropriate fields that you set up your profile with us. All right, so we'll move into the main event for today. We're very excited to have Dr. Ellen Choi joining us. Ellen is an assistant professor in the Ted Rogers School of Management, Ryerson University, where she teaches in the areas of organizational behavior, covering things such as leadership, training and development, motivation, and decision making. She is also an organizational psychologist with training in the fields of social psychology and organizational behavior. She received her PhD from the Ivy School of Business, as well as her Master's of Science from the London School of Economics. Her research interests revolve around workplace well-being and mental health, and she is also a yoga instructor, executive meditation coach, and delivers mindfulness workshops and keynote addresses to corporate audiences. So we're very excited to have her join us today, and I'm happy to pass things over to you, Ellen, and thank you so much for being here today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And I would say nice to see you, but I can't see you. But thank you to those of you that have tuned in or are watching later. Today's talk is looking at an idea that starts to ask, is mindfulness, is well-being a space that everyone feels welcome in? And the genesis for this research project came from this idea that when you were first Googling stress in COVID, Google was offering as an immediate feed this invitation to explore mindfulness. And I think it was even coming from Canada Health. And I thought, not only has mindfulness become such a widespread buzzword, but it was surprising to me that this was one of the first hits on Google, because it isn't actually a practice or a space where everyone conceivably feels comfortable in, despite the fact that it's based on the premise that we're all human and everybody breathes and everyone experiences stress. And so that's what this research looks at in more detail. I'm going to start with just a really quick poll to see how you are doing right now. Perhaps an invitation to check in. So please join us.
Yes, and I've just launched the poll and we're starting to get our first votes in, if you will. All right, so I'll share the results, if you will, with the audience here. And so here we are. So today, how much like yourself do you feel right now? And our audience is at 58% are feeling somewhat like their self today. About 17% are feeling a lot like themselves, and a quarter of us, 25%, are feeling totally like myself. So those are the answers we've received from that check-in.
Interesting. But well, I'm happy to hear that and glad that nobody feels completely lost. So welcome if you're just arriving or transitioning from something busy. I suppose we can use this entire space in our time together to keep coming back to ourselves and seeing if we can practice a little bit of mindfulness in whatever way as we move through it. So what is mindfulness? In the simplest possible terms, I'm going to reference a paper that came out in 2006 and say that it involves awareness, an attitude, and an intention. And the many practices that we see, meditation, etc., are about training our minds to self-induce a state of whether it's calm or alertness or focus or peacefulness on a dime, on an instant. And that's what these techniques are intended to do. So can I just check in and see how many of you are familiar with this concept? Have you heard it before? Do you try it? Do you practice every day?
Okay. All right, so with the people joining us today, we have a small minority, around 8%, of saying they've never heard of mindfulness, and then a real even split. So we have 31% heard of it, another 31% tried it before, and another 31% working on establishing a mindfulness practice. No devotees, unfortunately, today. There's a 0% there. So that's the split that we have today.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, that's really good to know. And we are going to go through a little bit about what it is and what it isn't before we launch into some of the research that I had alluded to earlier. So for those of you that have never really experienced it in any consistent way, what I want to assure you of is that it is not, in fact, this super Zen state of rocks on rocks and rocks. And while there is a lot of evidence that shows it has these relationships to stress optimization or relaxation, etc., it doesn't mean that every time you sit and practice, you're going to have this super Zen experience. And if anything, I think that turns people off. There are, however, very distinct neural mechanisms that these types of practices train. And the way I was saying earlier, how it's this idea of self-inducing a particular state on purpose. When we get better at choosing what we focus on, knowing when our mind wanders, being able to let go of the thing that's bothering us, and then actually shifting our attention back to the anchor, whether it's the task you're working on at work or whether you're meditating and you're focusing on your breath. These are like muscles that you're developing in your brain. And as you could imagine, these are really helpful muscles to have. Another way, and perhaps a simpler way even, to think about mindfulness, it's just that life is really busy. It's full of things, events, experiences, feelings that we're often too busy or don't even want to deal with. So we are maybe avoiding them or busying ourselves with other things. And part of these practices invite us to stop, allow life's experiences to catch up to us, and then you actually give yourself permission to feel and become aware of what's happening. And then inevitably, as all things do, they come and go, so it passes. Which brings me to this idea of, is mindfulness for everyone? So let's just take a quick, I don't know, check in to see, how stressed have you been? How exhausted have you been in the last 3 months, to get a sense for maybe how many of you might actually benefit from a practice that helps you reduce stress. So how stressed out are you? Or maybe people that attend workplace wellness initiatives are less stressed. I'm not sure. Let's see.
Okay, so with our audience today, we have a 0% of never, and then a little bit of a minority for 13% on rarely, and on the opposite spectrum, 13% also has said way too often. And then almost half of our audience today, so 44%, is looking at sometimes. And then we do have around 31% answering often. So quite the spectrum here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. I appreciate it. And I think it's interesting because we've just asked this question to reflect on the last 3 months, which includes some of the summer months. So I don't know if that's picking up and influencing the responses, but the figures I saw just now are actually far lower than what I would expect to see in a typical audience, and certainly a set of frontliners where I'm seeing sort of 4s and 5s, or often or way too often reflected. And the reality is, and maybe again, we're catching you on a good day, but most of us have a lot of colorfulness coming out, and it reflects this fact that we're living and working in circumstances that are very straining for how our human psychology tends to prefer, which is control, certainty, clear cut direction and expectations. Some of that is a function of what's happening in just trends in the workplace, and that there's a lot of work-life conflict or spillover. There are increasing pressures to work together in teams, even though many tasks are actually better suited to just complete as individuals. But it can be quite taxing. And again, mindfulness has been so popular because it's been shown to have positive effects on burnout and influence on well-being, etc. So really quickly, in a nutshell, we're seeing one pocket of research that looks at stress, well-being, and health. We see another bucket of research that looks at cognitive enhancements, so improvements to how you're thinking, recalling information, and general functioning, particularly as you get older. And then we see a number of relational benefits. In the workplace in particular, there's just been, I've put them in 2 paragraphs because there's a first wave of research that looks at mindfulness, but then there's this recent, just incredible surge of research demonstrating how mindfulness can be helpful and why and in which contexts. So again, I think this tendency to expect that mindfulness has something to offer everyone is very, it's very appealing. Have you ever done so many polls in your life? I'm not sure, but I would really love to know who is here. So would you mind answering this question for us, please?
Okay, so we have quite an audience. So we do have around, a good half saying they are identifying in the demographic of white. We have around 11% Black, 5% Indigenous, 32% Asian or Southeast Asian. And then going to that second page, we have 25 Latina or Hispanic, 25 feeling multiple, so they're identifying multiple groups, and then another 50 feeling that they're not really feeling what all of the options we provided have been provided today.
Okay. So that's a set of percentages that is difficult for me to digest because together they add up to more than 100, and I can't tell out of the 27 attendees now how many people have participated. So what I want to reflect back to you is that in seeing the responses in real time here, it appears that we may be a fairly diverse group. And when I was interviewing participants for this study, trying to understand more about how diverse the mindfulness community is and what experiences are like of minoritized individuals, the overwhelming response is that this community and that well-being, perhaps in general as a movement, is very much a white space. And so let's unpack that a little bit. When you Google image mindfulness, and I did this in preparation for this presentation, so this is really recent, there is actually some diversity reflected in these cartoon images. And I think that's so fascinating because when I first started studying mindfulness, which would have been in 2011, 2012, so about 10 years ago, the images looked very different. And something is happening. We're much more aware of how we want these practices to be represented. But again, there is opinions, experiences that are demonstrating that maybe it's not actually as diverse as Google Images, and maybe this current webinar may suggest. So I would love to get a sense for this on your end. How often have you ever felt like you were the only minority in the room? And second question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no worries.
I'll launch the second one right away.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll go back and share. Okay, so I'll go back a step and share the first one. So have you ever felt like you were the only minority in the room? So we have 39% attendees today saying yes, 44% responding no, and 17% maybe.
If you wrote maybe, would you mind putting in the chat what you mean by that? It would be great to get a sense for what that is. And I know it's hard to have dialogue in this webinar sort of platform, but if you're able to shed some light on what that is, we could have a bit more of a discussion. No pressure, and we can move on to the second poll response as well.
Okay, great. So let me just change gears here. And there we go. Okay, so in that second question, we have, do you notice when you're in a space without any minoritized ethnic groups, 71% of our attendees have said yes, 18% have said no, and then we do have a little minority there of 12% saying maybe as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much for those responses. I asked that question because it was one of the findings that emerged from some of these interviews where people that were white were saying, I had never until I began doing this work, looking really carefully at diversity in the mindfulness community, recognized how often all the groups that I was leading were with white audiences. And now wherever I go, I see, oh goodness, there's just white people here, or this is a really diverse ethnic group that I'm within. And personally, I am, as you can see, Asian. And I grew up in the beaches in Toronto. I think in our high school, there were probably 5 or 6 non-white people. And because of that, I actually often don't notice when I'm the only minoritized ethnic group, because I'm so used to being in white spaces. But again, the more that I do this work and the older I get, frankly, I've started paying more attention to when I'm in a diverse ethnic group. And I work at a university, which is formerly Ryerson and now Toronto Metropolitan University. And the students are incredibly diverse. And diverse in the fact that there's often in a classroom very few white people. And I think it's fascinating because when I ride the subway, it looks very different. When I'm in different spots in Toronto, it's very different. And last weekend, I was at a wedding, and again, it's very different. And I think if we're not able to pay attention to the makeup, the diversity with any group in any space we're in, then we can't really begin having conversations that help shift the phenomenon that we're going to be talking about. This was one of the initial quotes that really informed what this research was based on. So when you don't see yourself in a wellness space or a space that's supposed to be about healing, it's like, well, what does that say about how I should heal? Just seeing someone who looks like you in a physical space can function as a signal to you that you belong and are welcome. And hearing a voice that sounds like yours is like auditory assurance that your experience is valid and acknowledged. All right, so critical race theory, and if you watch the news at all, it's one of the topics that's often covered in current events because critical race theory was offered as part of mandatory education in the US, and slowly with the different governments taking place, they're asking for this to be removed. But it's the idea that within every system, particularly in education, because in this research, I'm applying critical race theory to education, that it's not actually an even playing field, and that it begins with this idea that there is no thing as color blindness. And if we are looking at experiences as colorblind, then we are immediately missing something offhand. Two, that sort of this white European experience is just normative. And again, just sharing a personal experience, I think about what it was like growing up and reading fashion magazines and trying to find makeup tips for Asian people when nobody looked like me in those magazines. And that's just learning how to apply eyeshadow, let alone the different types of education that would occur in any other educational institution. Critical race theory also says that 3, there are advantages and disadvantages that are derivatives of race, and that we can look to the law to help make improvements, but that even the law is a system that reflects some of these injustices. So I won't read this out, but if you apply those main ideas to institution, and to education, it's basically saying that the things that we're learning, the systems that we're learning them within, the funnel, if you will, of how teachers are educated, it's reflecting back a set of systemic disadvantages that maybe we are not aware of because it's so deeply embedded into the experience itself. So taking those theories, I was curious to see, could they help us explain what we were seeing in some of the popular press about wellness as a white space? So we did 33 interviews, and the majority of participants were female. It's not a poll question I put in this one, but I'm curious even how many of you today in this session are male versus female. And we have 20 people of color and 13 Caucasian people. And some were practitioners, some were instructors, some were CEOs of different mindfulness companies. And we spoke on Zoom, and this is what we found. So in looking at some of the structural barriers, there's this idea that when mindfulness was first introduced to the world of the West, it had to be incredibly empirically supported. They really wanted a strong scientific evidence base, because otherwise it would be very easy for clinicians to disregard it as too woo-woo or too hippie or whatnot. So there was this real affinity towards making sure that these practices were validated. But that attachment to science and academia, again, it overlooks that for a study to be examined in that way, for researchers and for instructors to be able to have access to training that would allow them to even speak about these practices through an empirical base, that's not an even playing field. I wish I could see your faces to see if this resonates at all. Likewise, I had one CEO who leads a well-established mindfulness company say they are trying very hard to attract more diverse instructors, but it's very hard to find people who are interested and who have enough training to be able to lead a session in a way that they feel like they would be protected if something went wrong. And that means the training pipeline itself just isn't diverse enough. And I think with leadership research on men versus women in business, this was an issue for many years, to ensure that the pipeline actually includes women moving up so that they can be promoted. And we're seeing a similar phenomenon. This idea of a white Jesus, which is what Jon Kabat-Zinn was often referred to by multiple people in the interviews, was fascinating to me. So Jon Kabat-Zinn is known as sort of the father of modern day mindfulness, in that he's one of the very first researchers that brought this idea, this concept into the West from the East, and then created MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction. And many of the first studies are led by people in his institution and in his research team. But why is it a white man? A blind spot or spiritual bypassing. So again, I think this is a really beautiful concept that comes out of this research, in that many people in the mindfulness and well-being community have nothing but the best intentions, and they want so deeply to help alleviate suffering for all people. And they're incredibly compassionate, and they see themselves in this way. And in seeing themselves in this way, seeing themselves as kind and compassionate, they weren't aware of the fact that these practices wouldn't be accessible. They weren't even aware that it might be isolating. I hope that makes sense. And just the idea that mindfulness and many well-being communities didn't feel accessible, equitable, and that they were incredibly privileged spaces to begin with. And I think Lululemon has received some criticism for this, but if you're selling $120 leggings, then maybe that kind of comfort isn't actually accessible for everyone. If you think about the cost of a smoothie in any sort of, wellness chain, and I'm thinking of several of them, so I won't call them out, but if you want to eat healthy, it's considerably more expensive. And some people in the interviews, they talked about how difficult it is just to access healthy food. Like you would have to ride a bus to get to a grocery store that sold fresh fruits and vegetables, let alone spending $25 or more to actually attend a mindfulness practice or a yoga practice, etc. Social barriers. So these are things happening interpersonally or within the group. And I wanted to put that poll question of, have you ever walked into a space where you feel like you are the only woman or the only Asian person? Because it's a really unique experience. And sort of this idea of the burden of being a racialized minority, or some people might call that white privilege on the flip side of it, where if something happens to you that's unpleasant or uncivil or a microaggression, you have to wonder, is this because I don't look like the rest of them? And that's quite a heavy toll on someone's psyche. Yeah, I'll share this with you here. Last week on Friday, I was riding the subway, and I was riding the subway to go speak at a conference on mental health and mindfulness and well-being and stress reduction and all the good things. And as I was coming up the stairs to exit the subway, 3 men sort of harassed me for wearing a mask, and it was awful. And I couldn't help but wonder, of all the people wearing the mask, why did they pick me to accost? And when I arrived at the conference, I was talking about this incident with a colleague who was also Asian, and her first response was, well, it's because you're Asian. And that's the kind of burden or safety versus unsafety that can be experienced. And what people in these interviews were expressing was that even in these places of healing, these triggers exist. Finally, I'll go to individual barriers. Sometimes there are aspects of our own psyche that prevent us from feeling like we belong somewhere. And critical race theory will call this internalized white supremacy. The word white supremacy might be off-putting, so I want to honor that experience you might be having on your side of the screen. It is also a word that showed up so often in these interviews, and I bristled with it when I first kept coming across it, but it was just spoken about so often. So if you have internalized white supremacy, then you would have experiences where that thing is just not for me. Maybe self-care isn't something that falls within our culture. It might be just this absolute resistance, or you might even experience shame if you had to acknowledge that you were stressed out. And this idea of, there's no way I'm doing downward dog in front of my homies. People would talk about how if they ever got caught meditating or doing yoga, or even admitting that they needed some kind of help and support, culturally it wouldn't be accepted, and that internalized would mean that they just take themselves out of that race. Okay, so I would really love to know, as you hear the things that I'm saying, what are some of your immediate reactions? And to avoid really long responses, perhaps you could summarize them in 3 words. What are your immediate reactions in 3 words? And could you type them into the chat so that Elizabeth can read them and we can get some sense of community here?
I'll just take a moment to remind that it's that questions box in the GoToWebinar panel that you can submit, and I'm just wait a moment as people begin typing and putting together their thoughts. And I'll take this opportunity as well to just do that 10-minute time check too, before we're looking to move into Q&A. So we have eye-opening, hidden injustice, disappointment, upset, surprise. These are the first few coming in. Shocked is another one. I'll just leave a little bit of space for more answers.
Thank you. Thank you for putting those in. I do really appreciate it.
We have another answer of sad.
I feel really privileged to be able to have this conversation, even if it feels like I'm having it to myself and my computer. Because if we don't create space to talk about these things, then shock and surprise and a long way to go will remain the experience for too long. And I love that we're moving into a period of time where it's more permissible to have these conversations, that people that are racialized can find community and solace in each other. And a really important thing to consider if you're in a position where you're bringing these practices into your organizations is that if you think of that cartoon that I showed you on the slide where there's so many colorful things coming out of your mind, for some people that colorfulness is like, oh, did I respond to that email? And I haven't registered my kids for summer camp yet. And oh my gosh, I need to get an extra set of sheets for the beds at the cottage. And that isn't to make people feel guilty for the privileges that they have. Hey, we're happy for you. We're just asking you in this research to hold space to honor that for other people. What's in that colorfulness could be very different. And when you come into a space where you're invited to talk about stress, that there may actually be norms around what stress is allowed to be talked about. So in psychology, we would call these display rules. Or if you're familiar with the idea of toxic positivity, you know, at work, there's so much pressure to be happy. And if you're going to be negative, maybe there's certain topics that you can be negative about, like a terrible boss or an unfair deadline, hybrid workplaces. But is there space to acknowledge that the person you work beside every day may get continually harassed on the subway because they look a certain way, or that they have experienced a long list of microaggressions that leave them experiencing a bubble of self-doubt and unworthiness, that many humans would experience those things anyways, but haven't been reinforced by their external world. When I teach the students at formerly Ryerson, we talk a lot about racial injustices, and what just breaks my heart is that these young, full of potential students have been discounted so overtly over and over, and they could all share these experiences. And it's, well, it's just not okay. That was a long rant. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. Here are some recommendations for progress. So as I'm saying, create the space for others to come. If you notice, and in a lot of my studies, I look at different types of wellness interventions, and they are overwhelmingly white and middle-aged women. And we have to do better as a in a research community to ensure that we're studying more diverse populations. But if you are putting these programs on and you're seeing that only a certain demographic are coming, then you have to do more work to understand and hear the voices that would help you understand how to bring more people, or what are the topics that we need in order to support everyone. I'm going to jump to the bottom for a moment, this affinity groups and integration, because there are more and more apps or programs that are like mindfulness for people of color, where people of color are the instructors. They use a broader set of practices that are more culturally sensitive. And there was a lot of discussion in my interviews about, is this problematic? Do we want to have all of these silos of different people? When are we going to integrate and actually advance the human race? And the takeaway I have from this research is that sometimes it's really important for people with shared experiences to arrive at a place of healing where you never need to actually talk about all of those microaggressions, because you just understand each other. And I'm thinking about certain kind of grief counseling, for instance. Like if you've lost a child, you don't want to have to explain how difficult that experience is to somebody else who's never experienced it. You just want to feel seen by others, knowing that you've had that shared experience, so you can get to a place of healing before you integrate. The other thing is, if they're saying it, it must be true. This came from one of the interviews, and she's might be one of the wisest people I've had the pleasure of meeting in real life. And she just said over and over, because she is a white woman that's been in the mindfulness community for a really long time, and she just said, if people are saying these things, it must be true, because she very clearly didn't agree with them. She very clearly had done everything she could to make the space more integrated, and yet she had so much humility in allowing a opposing opinion exist and just honoring it and creating space for it without any of that pushback or defensiveness. Part of critical race theory says when we study these things in practice, it allows us to put a name to call out something that's happening for what it is. And that's the power of language and terminology in general. So here are some that might help bring attention to the phenomenons that were that emerging. So white awake instruction, this idea that you are very aware, you've done your own work of understanding how racialized experiences are different. Safe for who space. So trauma-informed instruction. When I ask many people to close their eyes and pay attention to their breath, for many people that might be relaxing, but for other people that might feel like the beginning of an execution. And there is a lot of mindfulness being brought into inner city schools, for example. And in some of the interviews, they talked about how being told to close your eyes is actually like the beginning of feeling like you're going to be executed, and it's not safe to do that in any context. So that's actually triggering rather than relaxing. I know I'm close to time here, so I'll just touch on the idea of bridging. So if bridging is acknowledging that the way that mindfulness is taught today, the way that well-being is discussed, might unintentionally be built upon a foundation that reflects a really white normative standard or quality, then bridging would say, where can we be more culturally sensitive? Where can we be more inclusive? Is there an opportunity to celebrate dance, music, and art therapy alongside some of these other traditions? I think this is my last slide. And hopefully something that you can take with you just to appreciate that despite our best intentions, we're quite a ways off, because there are many people who are just struggling to have enough food to eat. And with inflation and gas and the different things taking place in the world these days, this is all the more true. And so buying a $12 smoothie may be a long way away from what well-being is, and how can we actually create community in a way that talks about well-being and human dignity in a way that's far more inclusive. So thank you. I will stop showing my screen and we can talk about any questions you might have, or thoughts or feelings, or anything that honors a lot of what I've just said here.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I'll just point that there was a closing chat checkout. So with what you mentioned just now, what is one insight that resonated with you? So I would offer that out to our audience today, if that also sparks perhaps some thoughts or questions to end today in our discussion. So I'll just leave that out there with our audience to potentially participate in. But I'll start off with the first question we have in our chat here. So for a leader looking to implement a mindfulness program at work, how can they look to make that mindfulness program accessible and ensuring that there is that space for diversity and kind of all feel welcome to join?
Really great question. Before you go out and just carte blanche offer mindfulness, I would try and get a better understanding of what the stressors are that your people are dealing with. And you may need not a really official, formal survey or organizational effort to do that, because there's probably individual differences in how comfortable and vulnerable and honest or authentic people are willing to be. But however you can get a better understanding of the stressors that people are experiencing before you just offer mindfulness as the antidote, that would be important. Because if people are talking about work overload, then there's probably aspects of mindfulness that will be helpful to them. But if you have a contingent of employees, and frankly, even if it's just one that struggles with, I don't know, racial injustice, and I see this in my surveys all the time, so I know it's a thing, then some support also needs to be made to hold that suffering and pain in a way that makes it more permissible to talk about as an organization. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely, and perhaps even to kind of have a secondary question on that. So not even just in mindfulness, when we think of this wellness space, and perhaps EAP is another example that a lot of workplaces look at, like just looking at the wellness space that employers are trying to provide. Is there any extra insight from that answer you just provided that you would add when looking at the broader scope of perhaps the wellness programs in workplaces?
Yeah. Again, I think it's, if I could leave this like image with you, when you think about what wellness is and what you're trying to do with wellness, if you're thinking about it as like diet, exercise, sleep, nutrition, stress, that's important to note, because when in this age where we are talking about race, I think it's so important to understand that a healthy, psychologically safe, non-toxic workplace means you have to honor that people from different backgrounds and experiences are suffering with really different, are at really different places in their wellness indicators. And there's a paper that advocates for what they called Black Days, where every time you see that a person of color has been killed by the authorities, it actually is heartbreaking in a way that makes it difficult to go to work. And that in their research, they were finding that people of color wished that they could just take a day off when this happens. And I think that speaks to the weight of what different marginalized ethnicities experience in a way that we're just not, it's just not part of the well-being zeitgeist.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely thinking in a whole different arena, as you said, not even being even awareness that that would be something that could be extremely impactful for an employee or just individual.
Yeah. So like what are the drivers of well-being? Where is it that you are vulnerable to, I don't know, I'm going to call it workplace stressors, which is really a blanket term, but the more you can understand the stressors that your employees experience, the more you can sort of carefully curate a set of wellness supports that meet people where they're at.
Great, thank you so much. The next question coming in here is, how do you create a sense of belonging for a new employee that is of a minority group and they don't see themselves represented in that workplace or perhaps in management? So how can, again, just create that sense of belonging and provide that support?
I mean, the first thing that comes up for me is the idea of a climate of authenticity, which is like a group level construct that gets at, is it okay to be distressed in front of the group? So can you create a culture where it's okay to talk about these things? So less so about onboarding the individual and like a one-to-one exchange of how can I make this person feel more comfortable, but a more careful contemplation of what is the culture that we've created here? Is it open? Is it accepting? And I mean, is there space to say, if I'm the only person here that looks like this, is there room to talk about what that experience is like? Like, is it safe to do that? And then what are all the cultural things that you can do to create that kind of safety?
Great, thank you for that. We're almost at the end of our time, so I'll leave with a final question here that kind of follows the themes of some of those words we had earlier of feeling that overwhelm and shock and everything we heard today, and that can feel like such a large thing to tackle. So from with that individual perspective, what as a person can you maybe do to help try and move this forward, move that progression into that more inclusive direction that we've talked about today?
At the risk of sounding tautological, I would suggest the more curious, accepting, and present you can become within yourself, the more of a conduit you would become to hold the suffering of another. And there's a really beautiful poem called The Invitation. I highly recommend you Google it when we hang up. And there's a line that says, can I just be with your suffering without trying to fix it? And I think that is the quality that if you are not immediately experiencing these things, when I tell people about what happened to me on the subway, I would want someone to be able to sit for a moment in how horrible that feels like, rather than trying to make it better or trying to deny the experience or minimize it in any way. And that takes a lot of inner work. So I would say, as an individual, do the inner work so that you can hold the space for others that are moving through really different experiences than yourself.
Thank you so much. And we are, oh, let me just check one last thing. Oh, look at that. One of our, we've got the link to the poem right in the chat there we were able
Thanks,
to find it
Emma.
in real time. So that's wonderful. We are at the top of the hour, actually just 1 minute past, so we will close with our time together today. I just have a couple notes to the audience, but would very much like to extend my appreciation for holding space for this conversation, for this discussion, and really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness and expertise bringing to this space, Ellen, today. Very much appreciated.
Yeah, it's totally my pleasure. And thanks for bringing me here so that we could even talk about it to begin with.
Wonderful. So just to close out today, thank you again very much to our audience for being here and attending this webinar. And as I'm sure a lot of are feeling, there's a lot of thought-provoking and things to digest from this. So this has been recorded. This will be an ever-living webinar, and you'll be sent that directly through that post communications email, but also in our website and on our eCampus, you'll also be able to see it there, and they are created for public access, so there is no fee to creating or experiencing this educational learning again. Also, just again to our members, that certificate of attendance will automatically be processed for you. And if you are interested in membership with WWI, please visit our website, workwellnessinstitute.org. And you can also reach out to our membership services, which is very simply membership services at workwellnessinstitute.org as well. And we do have a handout in the section of the toolbox here on GoToWebinar that does have some of those FAQs if that's of interest for you. We do have an extensive educational programming here, and you can look at all of that through our website, and we hope to see you joining us in our next webinar that is in October on interventions for bullying in the workplace with Dr. Michelle Tuckey. So hopefully we will see you all again next month. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you, Ellen, as well, for sharing your time with us today.
My pleasure. Have a nice day.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And I will exit it for everyone, so no further clicks on anybody's end. Bye for now.
Bye.